Okay, so domain name system, DNS. So DNS is one of the kind of most important services basically on the network. It's the first kind of stopping point that our browser will make after the user has typed in a domain name. It will, because the network doesn't understand, for example, where google.com is or where any domain name is, because that's not the way that the network is run and works. The way that the resources and computers, so computers that hold resources, are located on the network is via internet protocol addresses, so IP addresses. So every single computer on the network will have a unique IP address, whether it's in IPv4 format or version IPv version 6 format. And IP addresses can be either static or dynamic. So, for example, the server will have a static IP as provided by the manufacturer. For example, servers where you don't want the IP address to ever change, and then you'll have dynamic IP addresses, which, for example, clients and client computers will have sometimes, because they can change dynamically without any adverse kind of issues when it comes to being on the network. So when a user types into the browser, say google.com, the transport layer protocol on the network, which is layer 4, which deals with how data is transported on the network, basically needs to first understand where exactly am I sending this data. And because the network doesn't understand domain names, we need to have a central location where all of the domain names that humans can input into a browser are correlated with their IP addresses of where the resources actually reside on the network. So every domain name will have a correlated IP address, and the domain name system is the system that basically holds this data and serves it to the clients, i.e., the browser. So, DNS. So, there are two types of DNS server. There's the authoritative domain name server and the recursive domain name server. And so we are, say, the browser application, the client that is within this computer and is connected to the network and wants to get a website, and therefore is connecting with the DNS server to find the corresponding IP address to the domain name that the user has inputted into the browser. So the first point of call will be the recursive DNS server, which is provided by your internet service provider. And so we're usually basically interacting directly with the recursive DNS server. We don't usually interact directly with the authoritative, should be authoritative, not authoritative DNS server. So we just basically ask recursive DNS server, what is the IP address for example, qu.b or google.com or whichever other website the client is looking for. And the recursive DNS server goes off and does all of the other work. So the DNS server will typically, so just to quickly go through what they do. So the authoritative server is responsible for the domain names. So all of the domain names and their correlated IP addresses are within the authoritative name server. That's where they live. The recursive server, which is the server that we typically interact with, provided to us by our internet service provider, doesn't actually know anything, and it always needs to ask the authoritative server for this information. And so as soon as it gets information back from the authoritative server, it can usually cache this data for a while, so that if there's another request for the same IP, it doesn't have to go through this entire system. It can just, respond with the cached IP address for that domain name. So I'm still understanding exactly how this works, because obviously this is the authoritative name server, this is the recursive DNS server. So if there are two types of server, then I'm not entirely sure if these two servers are authoritative servers or recursive servers or another type of server. It seems to me that they're probably part of the authoritative servers, but just holding different types of information. But let's just go through it. So the recursive DNS server will first go to the root name server as the first point of call and say, do you have qu.b? And the root name server will either say, yes, I do, here it is, and it goes straight back to the client, or it will say no, ask the top level domain server. So then the recursive DNS server will go to the top level domain name server and say, do you have qu.b? And it will reply back, yes, I do, here it is, and that'll go straight back to the client, or it will say no, ask the authoritative server. And then at this point, the recursive DNS server will then go to the authoritative name server, which definitely has the data it needs, because this is the last point of call and this is where all the data resides. And then it will respond back, yes, I do, and here is the IP address for that domain, and then that will feed that back through to the client. So looking at this, it seems like these two aren't necessarily an authoritative name server, because this authoritative name server holds all of the data. The recursive DNS server holds none of the data except for maybe what it might have in cache for a while. So it just seems like these two are just not necessarily recursive or authoritative, but they're just other servers that can be kind of used before, kind of to catch before having to go to the authoritative server. So instead of overloading the authoritative server, it looks like it can go to the root name server. If the root name server has it, it can feed it back. If not, the top line domain server. So it kind of just filters out the traffic to the authoritative server so that it doesn't overload it. Obviously, there'll be more than one server, I'm assuming. However, so that's kind of my understanding. I think as I get further and further into it, it'll probably become less blurry in terms of exactly what these are, if there are only two types of DNS server. The kind of the online resources kind of all paint a slightly different picture. Like if you type in DNS and go to images, they all look very, very different. But I think this is a good understanding, just kind of overview, that the client, the browser, will request from the DNS an IP for a certain domain name, and it will either have it in cache or have to consult other servers in its architecture to then feed back the IP address to the client. So I think overview-wise, that is good enough. And I guess as time goes on, I'll probably fill in a few holes that I have left.